Hi, I'm Dr. Lisa Marie Jones, and for this lecture, I'll be discussing levels of racism in health as told by Cameron Phyllis Jones. Race-associated differences in health outcomes are routinely documented in this country, yet, for the most part, they remain poorly explained. Indeed, rather than vigorously exploring the basis of the differences, many scientists either adjust for race or restrict their studies to one racial group. Ignoring the etiologic clues embedded in group differences impedes the advance of scientific knowledge, and it limits efforts at primary prevention, and it also perpetuates ideas of biologically determined differences between the races. The variable race is not a biological construct that reflects innate differences, but it's a social construct that precisely captures the impacts of racism. For this reason, some people now hypothesize that race-associated differences in health outcomes are in fact due to the effects of racism and not actual biological race itself. So Cameron Phyllis Jones has developed a framework for understanding racism on 3 levels: the institutionalized, the personally mediated, and the internalized levels. This framework is useful for raising new hypotheses about the bases of race-associated differences in health outcomes, as well as for designing effective interventions to eliminate those differences. Institutionalized racism is defined as differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. Institutionalized racism is normative, sometimes legalized, and often manifests as inherited disadvantage. It's structural, having been codified in our institutions of custom, practice, and law. So there's no need to be an identifiable perpetrator. Indeed, institutionalized racism is often evident as inaction in the face of need. Institutionalized racism manifests itself both in material conditions and in access to power. With regard to material conditions, examples include differential access to quality education, sound housing, gainful employment, appropriate medical facilities, and a clean environment. With regard to access to power, examples include differential access to information, including one's own history, resources, including wealth and organizational infrastructure, and voice, including voting rights, representation in government, and control of the media. Personally mediated racism is defined as prejudice and discrimination, where prejudice means differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intentions of others according to their race, and discrimination means differential actions towards others according to their race. Okay, this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Personally mediated racism can be intentional as well as unintentional, and it includes acts of commission as well as acts of omission, or what we've come to understand as microaggressions. Internalized racism is defined as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. It's characterized by their not believing in others who look like them and not believing in themselves. It involves accepting limitations to one's own full humanity, including one's spectrum of dreams, one's right to self-determination, and one's range of allowable self-expression. So we see here institutionalized racism and its initial historic insults, structural barriers, inaction in the face of need, societal norms, biological determinism, and unearned privilege. Personally mediated racism, I just defined already as prejudice, discrimination, etc. So it's looking at differential assumptions about abilities. This is just a recap. And it manifests as lack of respect, suspicion, devaluation, scapegoating, and dehumanization. Here's a picture. It's often condoned by societal norms. Remember, it can be intentional or unintentional, covert, overt, implicit or explicit. And then recapping internalized racism here again. It manifests as the embracing of whiteness or the primary or dominant groups, cultural norms. It reflects system of privilege, and it erodes individual sense of value. Okay, so let's get into this lecture a little bit here. We're going to talk about this allegory. This following allegory that I'm going to present is useful for illustrating the relationship between the three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and for guiding our thinking about how to intervene. So, the woman who created this framework and her husband bought a house in Baltimore. There were 2 large flower boxes on the front porch, and when spring came, they decided to grow flowers in them. One of the boxes was empty, so they had to buy potting soil to fill it. They didn't do anything to the soil in the other box, assuming that it was fine. Then they planted the seeds from a single seed packet in the 2 boxes. The seeds that were sown in the new potting soil quickly sprang up and flourished, and all the seeds sprouted. The most vital, towering, strong, and tall, and even the weak seeds made it to the middling height. However, the seeds that were planted in the old soil didn't do so well. Far fewer of the seeds sprouted, with the strong only making it to the middling height, and the weak dying. It turns out that the old soil was poor and rocky, in contrast to the new potting soil that they bought, which was rich and fertile. The difference in yield and appearance in the 2 flower boxes was vivid. It was a real-life illustration of the importance of environment. So, let's imagine a gardener who has 2 boxes, and one that she knows to be filled with rich, fertile soil, and another that she knows to be filled with poor, rocky soil. And the gardener has the 2 packets of seeds for the same type of flower. However, the plants grown from the packet of seeds will bear pink blossoms, while the plants grown from the other packet of seeds will bear red blossoms, even though they're the same flowers. The gardener prefers red over pink naturally, so she decides to plant the red seed in the rich, fertile soil, and the pink seeds in the poor, rocky soil. And sure enough, what is witnessed in the garden that of the designer of this framework comes to pass in this garden as well. All of the red flowers grow up and they flourish, with the fittest growing and the strong and even the weakest making it to the middling point. But the box with the poor rocky soil, things look a lot different. The weak among the pink don't even make it, and the strongest among them, which were growing, make it to the middling point, and in the time the flowers in these 2 boxes go to seed, dropping their progeny into the same soil in which they were growing. And the next year, the same thing happens, with the red flowers in the rich soil growing full and vigorous and strong, while the pink flowers in the soil struggle to survive. And the flowers go to seed. Year after year, the same things happen. 10 years later, the gardener comes to survey her garden. Gazing into the 2 boxes, she says, "I was right to prefer red over pink. Look at how vibrant and beautiful the red flowers look. And see how pitiful and scrawny the pink ones are." This part of the story illustrates some important aspects of institutionalized racism. There is the initial historical insult of separating the seed, first of all, into the two different types of soil. The contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes, which keep the soils separate, and the acts of omission in not addressing the differences between the soils over the years. The normative aspects of institutionalized racism are illustrated by the initial preference of the gardener for the pink, or for the red over the pink, Indeed, her assumptions that red is intrinsically better than pink may contribute to a blindness about the differences between the soils. So, where is the personally mediated racism in this gardener's tale? Well, that occurs when the gardener, disdaining the pink flowers because they look so poor and scraggly, which she didn't really care for in the beginning, then she plucks the pink blossoms off before they can even go to seed. Or when a seed from a pink flower has blown over into the rich soil, she plucks it out before it can establish itself. Where's the internalized racism in the tale? Well, that occurs when, let's say, a bee comes along to pollinate the pink flower, and the pink flower says, "No, stop! Don't bring me any of this pink pollen. I prefer red." The pink flowers have internalized the belief that red is better than pink because they look across at the other flower box and they see the red flowers are strong and flourishing. And they also see the care that is put into the red over the pink flower. So what we really have to do to set things right in this garden is address the institutionalized racism. We have to break down the boxes, mix up the soil, or we can leave the boxes separate, but fertilize the poor soil until it's rich and as the fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will grow at least as strong and vibrant as the red, and perhaps even stronger. You know why? Because they've been selected for survival. And when they do, the pink flowers will no longer think that red pollen is better than pink because they'll look over at the red flowers and see that they are equally strong and beautiful. And although the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, the gardener's children who grow up seeing the pink and red are equally beautiful will be unlikely to develop the same preferences as the parent. So this story illustrates the relationship between the three levels of racism, and it also highlights the fact that institutionalized racism is the most fundamental of three levels and must be addressed for important change to occur. Finally, it provides the insight that once institutionalized racism is addressed, the other levels of racism may cure themselves over time. Perhaps the most important question raised by this story is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one with the power to decide, the power to act, and the control over the resources. In the United States, the gardener is our government. And as the story illustrates, there's particular danger when this gardener is not concerned with equity or equality. The current initiative to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health by the year 2020 is to be lauded as the first explicit commitment by the government to achieve equity in health outcomes. We're not too sure how this might change under our new administration, however. Many other questions arise from this simple story. What's the role of public health researchers in vigorously exploring the basis of pink-red disparities, including the differences in the soil and the structural factors and the acts of omission that maintain those differences? How can we get the gardener to own the whole garden and not be satisfied when only the red flowers thrive? If the gardener is not going to invest in the whole garden, how can the pink flowers recruit or grow their own gardener? This is my reference here. And thank you so much for your time, and this concludes my lecture.